Now, the Boeing 757 and Boeing 767 aircraft are very similar in design, just difference in engines and size of the aircraft and the passengers that they hold. The flight crews that fly these airplanes are usually qualified to fly both. And just to give you an idea of how these planes are actually programmed to fly, because Boeing, in the design of these airplanes, wanted these airplanes to be flown by the computer. They really prefer the flight crews not to hand fly the airplanes. And what most pilots do that fly these, usually at about 1,000 feet after takeoff, they engage the autopilot. And the autopilot will then take over the pre-programmed flight that has been put into the computer, which, by the way, is done prior to pushback at the gate. So when the airplane is sitting at the gate and you're boarding the airplane, the pilots up front are putting in the navigational coordinates, they're putting in the flight parameters, how fast the plane's going to go, that sort of thing. And at about 1,000 feet after takeoff, the pilot hits the button and the plane then flies itself, because that's really the way Boeing wants the airplane to be flown. Now, a very close friend of mine is a Boeing 757 pilot, and I recently had the opportunity to go into a training class with him and actually fly the airplane for about an hour and a half. And I can tell you, when it's on the computer, it's a joy to fly. And when you have to take over and fly it by hand, which I also had the opportunity to do, it does require a bit of work, and certainly a novice pilot would not be able to do that. I mean,
so either these terrorists were accomplished pilots, or else they were able to convince the pilot, the original pilot of the plane, to direct it straight into the World Trade Center?
Well, I would have to think that your first scenario is probably more plausible, that the hijackers probably knew their way around the cockpit, because I can't imagine that a flight crew would intentionally, I mean, who knows under what kind of duress your response would be, but knowing the way these airplanes are designed, and again, having had the chance to fly them, you don't just sit down and start flying them. Because you have to disengage the autopilot. It's already on a pre-programmed flight, and so you have to take it off of that flight and literally then hand fly it. And also there's the airplane has something called auto throttles, and that's being used during the flight, meaning that the power is managed by the computer. So you have to turn that off as well. So someone would have to know what buttons to push to be able to steer that airplane.
At what point do you think the people who were in air traffic control said something's wrong here? They're looking at, presumably they're looking at these blips on a radar screen.
Yes. It could have been in two cases. One where the blip went off the course because of the pre-programmed courses that these aircraft had already been assigned to fly by air traffic control. Prior to leaving, every airplane has its assigned course, and they expect you and that aircraft to fly on that course. So once it started deviating, that could be the first sign. Maybe in communications, trying to reach the aircraft. The controller may not have gotten a correct response from the pilot. There are also devices on the airplane that the pilot can use to inform air traffic control of a hijack without alerting the hijackers. There's a particular code that is put into the transponder of the aircraft. The transponder being the ability for air traffic control to see the airplane in the sky and identify it as a particular airplane.
Is this the black box that you're talking about?
It's not. The black box is the box that is the flight recorder. This is a box that sits in the cockpit that every aircraft that flies in the air traffic control system is assigned a number, so aircraft can be interrogated by radar. When that number is changed to a particular code, alarms go off at air traffic control centers, alerting that controller that this plane is indeed being hijacked. Now, whether the flight crew had time to do that or not, we don't know.
But Nick, you're also talking about how sophisticated these guys probably had to be to know their way around the cockpit.
Absolutely.
Could they have known about what you're talking about right now, so that the flight crew could not have alerted anybody?
Absolutely. If they knew how to certainly disengage the autopilot and fly that airplane in some fashion, they could have indeed also put that transponder to read a code where they would have disappeared off the screen. Where, in other words, the code would have been changed so they couldn't track the airplane anymore, or it would be tracked without its identification. The controller would just see a little blip moving across the screen without the identification United Flight 175 or American Flight 11, because when the air traffic controllers look at their screens, every aircraft, of course, comes up with an identification.
What about the attack on the Pentagon? Would that have been a situation where the plane was just on that facility so quickly they didn't have time to react?
Very possibly. It seemed that if that was indeed the plane that took off from Washington Dulles, it wouldn't take very long to get there. And again, when you're talking about a 250,000-pound airplane being pointed at a specific target, that's not as easy as you think it is to do, because the plane has to be maneuvered, and it has a certain amount of momentum, and when you turn the airplane, there's a bit of a delay in the response of how the airplane performs. So there indeed is some skill involved in pointing the airplane exactly where you want it to go, especially if you're trying to use it in such a terrible fashion.